Okay, so we should be recording. So I'm Shawn Evans. I'm the Information Literacy and Instructional Design Librarian here at Decker Library. And I first of all want to thank my colleague Tanaz Motavalli, who did all the incredible work to bring this amazing panel together. They deserve a huge round of virtual applause. So please show them some love if you can use your little emoji icon to do an applause. And to begin today's event, please also join me in this preliminary land acknowledgement. So we are working with various versions to arrive at a final institutional statement here at MICA. But we acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Piscataway and Susquehanna tribes.
It's recorded, so no worries.
Oh, sorry, if you are not muted, please mute yourselves. I'll continue with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Piscataway and the Susquehanna tribes, and that Indigenous people have lived here since the 10th millennium BC and have been joined through the northern migration by the Lumbee and the Cherokee in this region we now call Baltimore. We also acknowledge the people enslaved and exploited who did and do work on this land, enabling us to live and Mother Earth, from which all life springs. Here at MICA, we strive to honor the ancestors and to work equitably and honorably towards social justice with their descendants. I also want to share with you our code of conduct for this space. Art and the Archive is dedicated to providing a harassment-free event experience for everyone, regardless of race, gender, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, age, religion, marital status, or any other vector of identity. This is a space where we agree to work together to break down our implicit and explicit biases and agree to hold ourselves and others accountable for the ways we either contribute to or subtract from safe and brave spaces. We point out harm when we see it, and we work within community to speak up if and when we see event attendees experiencing microaggressions, unfair and/or biased treatment, and inequitable exclusion. We will not tolerate harassment in any form. And lastly, to prepare you all for what's about to come, here's a little bit about the format of today's event. The event will include presentations from each of our speakers about their work as it relates to the theme of Black art and the archives. Then we will take a deeper dive into a moderated discussion. Throughout the event, please feel free to enter any audience questions into the Zoom chat. We will be keeping up with these questions as they come in and invite speakers to answer throughout the conversation. And I'll start with our two speaker intros, and then we'll kind of get all of my talking out of the way and get started with our program. So with all of that housekeeping out of the way, I am honored to invite our speakers to share their work with us today. First up is Jessica Douglas. Jessica Douglas is an archivist and historical researcher from Baltimore, Maryland. She is a graduate of Fordham University in the Bronx, New York, where she studied history and political science and previously worked at Baltimore City Archives and Maryland State Archives as a reference archivist. Her work focuses on collaborative, community-based, and liberatory archives and can be seen in participatory archives, theory and practice, for which she contributed a case study of the Preserve the Baltimore Uprisings 2015 digital archive, a user-submitted repository of materials related to the uprising. She also serves as a member of the advisory board for the PBU archive, as well as a member of the boards for the Mid-Atlantic Regional Moving Image Archive and the Friends of Wyman Park Dell. She is currently pursuing her master's in library and information science at the University of Maryland, College Park. Also with us today is Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle. Kenyatta is a multidisciplinary visual artist, writer, performer, and healer. Her practice fluctuates between collaborations and participatory projects with alternative gallery spaces within various communities to projects that are intimate and based upon her private experiences in relationship to historical events and context. Her practice serves as a bridge, merging the intersections of art, activism, spirituality, and healing as tools for retrieval. Her healing practice consists of being a catalyst for retrieval through the usage of Reiki, sound healing, divination, channeling, and mediumship. A term that has become mantra for her practice is, quote, historical present, unquote, as she examines the residue of history and how it affects our contemporary world perspective. Hinkle's artwork and experimental writing has been exhibited and performed at the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Hammer Museum, SF MoMA, and many, many more. Hinkle's work has also been reviewed by the Los Angeles Times, Art Forum, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, among others. She's also the recipient of several awards, including the Fulbright Fellowship, the Rema Hort Mann Foundation Emerging Artist Award, SF MoMA 2019 Seika Award, and the Hellman Fellowship from UC Berkeley.
Jessica Douglas and Kenyatta.
She has artworks in the private collection of the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Museum of Art at the University of New Hampshire, the San Jose Museum of Art, and SF MoMA. And her writing has appeared in Obsidian Journal, Art Forum, and Among Margins, Critical and Lyrical Writing on Aesthetics. She is also the author of Gentrifications, Convergent Truths and Realities, published by Litmus Press. Thank you both so much for being here today. We really look forward to hearing from you. So now I'd like to turn it over to Jessica Douglas to begin her presentations. Welcome so much, Jess.
Thank you. Hi, nice to see everybody, kind of. It's an honor to be here. I really appreciate everybody kind of joining us in this space, and I'm gonna try to share my screen. Just give me 1 minute, and all that I ask is that you ignore the number of windows that I have open on Google Chrome, and you cannot even see the number of tabs, so just ignore that part. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen now. I'm going to try to go into full screen mode. Just give it a minute. It's a fairly antiquated way of doing things. Okay. Can everybody see the screen, hopefully?
Yes, you're all good, Jess.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Douglas, and I'm an independent archivist and historical researcher. I previously worked at the Baltimore City Archives and the Maryland State Archives as a project archivist and then a reference archivist, but I now work independently, mostly doing contract work and for individuals and organizations who are interested in discovering their histories, or with assistance finding historic documents. I've worked with a couple of different scholars and authors, people like Baynard Woods, and I'm currently working with Single Carrot Theater on a project called Unmarked, which is a collaborative history-based theater project about 41 unmarked graves in St. John's Episcopal Church, which is just a few blocks from me in Waverly on Greenmount Avenue, up by the farmers market. And eventually that will be performed with, I think, 3 different playwrights, 3 local playwrighs who we've already discovered, and they're going to be performing 3 different original works of theatrical text based on the research that I've found, and community conversations that we've been having throughout the last couple of months. Eventually, this will result in hopefully some sort of commemorative piece that will be displayed at St. John's Church in order to remember the lives of those interred in the cemetery. I'm also a full-time grad student. Oh, wait, hold on. Forgive me. I've been working with a group of oral historians for the past 2 years, analyzing race in oral history projects based in Baltimore over the last 50 to 60 years. We've presented at the Oral History Association annual conference for the past 2 years, first to present our findings, and then later to discuss race and representation and power in oral history. Specifically, the first year I focused on patterns of normalized, inherent, and unspoken whiteness in the Baltimore Neighborhood Heritage Project, an oral history project largely funded and organized by the National Endowment for the Humanities and a few Baltimore-based institutions that collected oral histories from Baltimoreans in the 1970s and early 1980s during a citywide urban renewal and revitalization plan that led to white flight and Black people being displaced across the city. I found that the Baltimore Neighborhood Heritage Project gave voice to white ethnic populations in Baltimore, but ultimately its focus on predominantly white participants who often avoided discussion of race silenced coexisting Black voices that could have provided much needed insight and perspective into their lived experiences. And of course, I don't think that this amplification of white historical narratives is unique to oral history. And in fact, as an archivist, I believe it's even more prevalent in archives. Basically, my previous work has focused on digital archiving and community-based archives, particularly as an alternative to traditionally institutionally based archives in which archivists hold much of the decision-making power and accessibility is fairly limited. I'm on the advisory boards for two digital archives, the Preserve the Baltimore Uprising, or PBU 2015 Digital Archive, and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Moving Image Archive, aka MARMIA. Both of these archives expand accessibility by freely allowing users to view materials virtually. In the case of the PBU archives, it's also a community archive, meaning the items in the collection, photos, videos, and interviews related to the uprising that occurred in Baltimore in 2015 after Freddie Gray's murder have been submitted by the public. So now that I've introduced myself, I wanted to share some thoughts about Black representation and involvement in archives. Rather than attempting to provide a rundown of, for instance, the history of Black arts and culture in American archives, I think Kenyatta is going to do a much better job of that than I ever could. I started thinking about the relationship or lack thereof between Black people, Black arts and Black culture, and the archive in the past, present, and future. So first of all, what do we mean when we say the archive, and how does that differ from archives? The archive is much more of an idea or concept, and this is related to how we privilege and prioritize certain types of materials as the correct or worthy version of history. And when we think about archives, that is much more related to the institution and how we preserve, catalog, and make accessible specific types of records and collections. Until fairly recently, archives and archivists were considered neutral or impartial rather than, participating in social justice work, which some scholars have categorized as more of a personal obligation rather than a professional obligation. For instance, Mark Green and Randall Jimerson specifically said that this was a personal obligation, although they do consider it a worthy personal obligation. Michelle Caswell, who's an archivist and associate professor of archival studies in the Department of Information Studies at UCLA, pointed out that this neutral framework was flawed specifically because neutrality is a subjective concept in and of itself and changes depending upon your perspective rather than being concretely objective. And that because of the homogeneity of the archival field, which still tends towards white male, there are still a very limited variety of perspectives. Howard Zinn also speculated that the concept of archival neutrality is in itself worthy of criticism. He said, "The scholar may swear to his neutrality on the job, but whether he be physicist, historian, or archivist, his work will tend in this theory to maintain the existing social order by perpetuating its values, by legitimizing its priorities, by justifying its wars, perpetuating its prejudices, contributing to its xenophobia, and apologizing for its class order. Basically, much of the strained relationship between Black people and their arts and culture and archives boils down to power and the inability for those in power to cede control to allow Black people and other marginalized communities to actually preserve and share their histories, their culture, their art, their experiences on their own terms, rather than complying to the relatively stringent parameters set by archival institutions. This is why archivists by nature cannot be realistically neutral. Archivists wield so much power over the historic record, and until we in the archival field address biases in both archives and the archive at the foundational level, archives cannot and will not be a fully safe and trusted space for Black arts and culture. Another scholar, Rodney G.S. Carter, reminded us that the notion that archives are neutral places with no vested interests has been undermined by current philosophical and theoretical handlings of the concept of the archive. It is now undeniable that archives are spaces of power. Archival power is, in part, the power to allow voices to be heard. It consists of highlighting certain narratives and of including certain types of records created by certain groups. The power of the archive is witnessed in the act of inclusion, but this is only one of its components. The power to exclude is a fundamental aspect of the archive. Inevitably, there are distortions, omissions, erasures, and silences in the archive. Not every story is told. So, rather than attempting to provide a rundown of the history of Black arts and culture in American archives, I started thinking about the relationship between Black people and the archive. And I asked myself a series of questions. How did Black people interact with archives in the past? And how has this changed in recent years, in the present? And how might archives and archivists change in the future? And how does that affect Black artists? In terms of the past, archives are rooted in the same institutional structures that created most institutions in the United States. That is to say, they are inherently autocratic because they were established, administered, and populated by and for upper class, wealthy, mostly landowning white men. Early archivists in the United States adhered to archival principles that autocratically centralized preservation of predominantly white elite histories, while simultaneously delegitimizing alternative forms of archiving and preservation that actually involved members of those marginalized communities. All people outside of that dominant demographic have, to varying degrees, suffered because of this. And that includes women, Black people, brown people, people from Native American, Indigenous, and tribal cultures, the LGBTQ community, immigrants, all have been underrepresented, marginalized, and denied access to archives. This is why historically, Black people were denied the education and resources required to properly archive their own histories, which is one of the reasons why spoken word, music, dance, and folklore became such integral components of our culture. Most Black people were too poor to have assets or property, and that left little to no record of their existence in the past, which is why so many Black people today encounter difficulty when trying to trace their genealogies. Black arts and culture, for instance, has flourished outside of and despite these barriers to archives. And it honestly wasn't until the 1970s that those within the archival field began to question fundamental archival theory and concepts. And much of this was inspired by critical theory, theories like post-colonialism and post-structuralism, that scholars began to call for a reanalysis and restructuring of archival theory and practice in a concerted effort to acknowledge and repair centuries of racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, generally patriarchal preferential treatment that continued to further marginalize underrepresented communities, particularly Black people in the United States. For instance, this is just an example. As a reference archivist at the Maryland State Archives, I would assist visitors with their research. Whether they were scholars, students, or just someone who wanted to find some historic vital records that would help them in their quest to complete their family tree and discover their ancestral heritage. Our job as reference archivists was to assist them with finding records, pointing them in the right direction with their research inquiries. And if we couldn't do it ourselves, we would connect them with the person that could assist them. But I cannot count the number of times that I assisted Black patrons in particular who were desperate to find something that could provide information about their family history. Most were well aware of the fact that because of slavery, there would often be gaps in information and vital records. The instances where I assisted patrons who came all the way down to Annapolis, hoping to find the names, birth and death dates, any sort of vital record about their ancestors, but they ultimately left empty-handed. Those were heartbreaking, to say the least, but it wasn't a rare occasion. Luckily, the Maryland State Archives does have a legacy of slavery department, which is led by Chris Haley, who is a very talented archivist and writer, and coincidentally, Alex Haley's nephew. And Alex Haley is the co-author of Malcolm X's autobiography and the author of Roots. But even in the instances where we were able to find vital records for Black patrons, we often had to search in relatively unorthodox record groups, such as estate records, tax records, and lists of indentures, because chances of finding the name of a Black ancestor in a normal record, birth record, death record, marriage, divorce decree, pertaining to property owned by that own person, was much less likely than the chances of us finding a reference to a Black person being listed as a piece of property in some capacity. In the present, there have been incremental shifts in power that have enabled people, especially Black people, to reclaim some of the power both inside and outside of institutionally affiliated or traditional archives. There's been a slow but increasing number of Black archivists and an increase in Black representation in staffing in archives, galleries, museums, and libraries. And we're seeing an increase in the number of archives and museums that are entirely dedicated to Black history and culture. Scholars, including Rodney G.S. Carter, who I quoted earlier, have kind of described this denial of access as a major impediment to marginalized groups and their ability to preserve their histories, cultures, and experiences. We're also seeing, thanks to advances in technology and private and grant funding, a huge increase in the number of independent archives dedicated to preserving the histories of marginalized groups that have been excluded from archives, both literally and metaphorically. Since the civil rights movement, I think there have been many communities that took it upon themselves to preserve their records and aspects of their culture, simply because they were either denied access to archives or they didn't trust the archives to actually properly preserve and share, make accessible their records. Today, there are scholars that have stressed the importance of taking steps now to ensure that the act of prioritizing and privileging predominantly white historical narratives remains a thing of the past, lest we continue to strain the relationship between marginalized groups and archives to the point of total alienation. So we have a list of archivists, librarians, and scholars, including Jenny Ferretti, who is a wonderful librarian at MICA, who have spoken openly and openly criticized archives and archivists for the rampant white supremacist ideals that are maintained in sort of institutional structures. For instance, Jarrett Drake, in a keynote address to the Community Archives Forum, said, The traditional ways that archives do business are in many ways antithetical to the notion of a community. So in many ways, the push for the creation of community archives is actually a coup of thinking and doing for many people who identify as archivists. Archives and archivists, as we've come to know them, don't care about community. They care about components, they care about control, and they care about capital. If community archives are to be the transformative spaces that I believe they have the capacity to be, they must not only resist the temptation to replicate these capitalist concerns, but also must establish their own sets of concerns that challenge traditional archival practice and theory. So in the future, it's unclear whether we'll fully reach a time where the histories of marginalized groups, particularly Black people, are ever considered to actually be a part of American history as rather than a separate component of American history, despite the fact that many of us know that these shared experiences, these unique experiences from different groups are what make up most of American history. I'm somewhat skeptical that without increased presence of Black people and people from other marginalized communities in archives, really in the decision-making, power holding positions, there will actually see substantial changes in archives. What we've been seeing more in the present tense is social justice in archives is becoming a much more common concept. We're actually seeing a lot more self-preservation, and by that I mean independent and personal archiving. There are many, many more community-based and participatory archives, including members of underrepresented communities having an active role in the creation and preservation of their own history. And we're seeing much more of a turn to digital archiving. And that is just an absolute way to increase accessibility. And we should acknowledge that not everybody has steady internet access. And so there are some hindrances to accessibility, but in general, the internet has allowed much more information to be shared freely and openly. This is a list of just a couple of community and participatory archives that I thought of off the top of my head. And while I was trying to come up with this list, I randomly tweeted that I was looking for a list of, community and participatory archives, because I know that collectively the Twitter sphere would be able to come up with many more than I would be able to come up with even just from searching the internet. And so I randomly tweeted on Sunday, hoping to find some responses, and it ended up, I am not Twitter famous by any means. So when I get like almost 400 likes and hundreds of responses on a thread, it's a big deal to me, especially when it's such an informative thread. So if anybody has any interest, please go to my Twitter. I have no other way of linking you to this right now. I'll drop the link in the comments actually. And I can share with you just a great list of participatory and community-based archives that so many people have contributed to it. And it's not just those that are occurring in Baltimore or Maryland or in the United States. And we got responses from people in Canada, Scotland, all over the place. So it's a really interesting thread, and I will drop that link in the comments so everybody else can see that. But that's basically all I had to say today. So I really appreciate you listening for a second.
Thank you so much, Jess. That was really wonderful, and I think a really excellent kind of look at the relationship between Black people and archives and community archives in this country. Really, really awesome. I look forward to our conversation, and I'm now going to turn it over to Kenyatta to talk to us a little bit more.
Hello, everyone. It's always so weird when I can't see folks. I'm gonna play my slideshow. Oh my gosh, Jessica, Wow, I don't even remember what I want to say about my own work because I am thinking about everything that you just presented and just speaking truth to power and like the accountability and just the relentless, like, no, this is white supremacy, this is that, resources in relationship to archival histories. And just, I mean, it was really powerful, such an informative presentation. So thank you so much. I'm honored to be going after you. So my perspective that I'm going to share is more so from being a kind of pseudo archivist, a kind of shaman artist archivist. I am a self-proclaimed ghost lady. So oftentimes I like to talk about what haunts me about archives. And a little bit about me, I am a MICA alum. I graduated in 2009, got my BFA in painting. And I was so honored when Tanaz reached out to me to invite me to be a part of this conversation because I had so many spiritual experiences in the Decker Library. And yeah, I was always really fascinated by the library holdings. And as a child, I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, not too far from the first Black public library like in the nation. Like it almost closed down, and Prince, the singer, he donated money to keep it open. So libraries, archives have always been a really huge part of my life. Okay, so I'm gonna jump right in. So a lot of my work is inspired by literary references, my love for books, my love for images that haunt, and people who kind of collect these archives of unseen, unknown, the unheard moments within our collective history, you know, in this country. One of my absolute favorite Toni Morrison quotes is, "Definitions belong to the definer, not the defined." And I think that echoes so much of what Jessica was presenting and talking about in relationship to who has the right to have access to the archive, to even create one in the first place. Even within a lot of my performance work, I will use work songs that were collected by Alan Lomax. A lot of times there's, I know this isn't the right thing to say this, and this is recorded, but theft. Like sometimes I just steal stuff. I just take images, you know? I take the images because how they were taken, they weren't, you know, given permission for the images to be taken in the first place. And then you have this like colonial postcard of this woman and her baby, and there's no agency there, but yet this document still lives. So a lot of my work is highly problematic. The things that I do are problematic, and I like talking about that, you know? So definitions belong to the definer, not the defined. I wake up with this every day. I eat this quote for breakfast because it's just so powerful to me, you know? I also have a podcast called Manifestations of Yaya. It talks about the intersections of art, spirituality, healing, and it has become an archive of just musings and things that I kind of have been thinking about collectively. A lot of times I will read literature and passages and things that haunt me. And I wanted to kind of start the talk with this because the first episode is on intuition, and I talk about being in the Decker Library and that in bibliomancy, how I just kept drawing this figure named Yaya in my sketchbook, you know, for years and years in high school and in college. And I went to the Decker and I found myself in the Haitian art section. And I just grabbed a book. I didn't know what I was doing, just grabbed the book off the shelf, opened it up, and there was a painting of a figure that looked exactly like this other figure that I kept drawing over and over, she told me her name was Yaya. And so I looked at the caption, you know, that describes the art, the dimensions, and it said Yaya in the caption. And I was like, oh my God. So I kind of talk about that in the podcast in the first episode. And I've kind of been collecting these memories or these kind of musings. So yes, tune into that if you're interested in podcasts. Also, oh my gosh, I'm really obsessed with Tina M. Camp's scholarship, Listening to Images. This is a pivotal text for me in my practice. You will see a couple of quotes of hers throughout my presentation. I'm clairaudient, which means I can hear things that people normally cannot hear. It's a part of, there's clairvoyancy, there's clairsentience, there's all of these different forms of extrasensory perception, right? I have all of them, but the majority of the ones that I have is the clairaudience. So when I came across this book in grad school, Listening to Images, I was like, oh, how does she know? How does she know? I was just like, are you kidding me? This is a whole book. This is a whole scholarship of like being able to sense what is going on in a photograph without having the exact information or something telling you that this is about this and this is about that, but just really being able to commune with the source and to write about what you don't know, what is kind of in between, you know, in between perception and what you're seeing and what you're feeling. I'm also really obsessed with Sadia Hartman's scholarship in her famous book, Lose Your Mother, how she got a Fulbright to go to Ghana to search for people that she will never, ever know the names of that perished during the Middle Passage. And so I'm really excited about these kind of newer forms of scholarship that kind of talk about ontology, that kind of talk about our relationship to archives, their problematic nature, and what does it mean to stumble across them and to really be able to touch and engage with them. She states, photographs are haptic objects, meaning they are not just something we're supposed to see. Photographs are made to be touched, to be handed from one person to the next, be it a portrait, a daguerreotype, an album. Our experiences with these images is really about touching them, leafing through them, giving them to other people, sending them to folks, framing them, displaying them. Those are not just encounters of vision or sight. So this whole idea of the photograph as an object that travels is a really huge component of a lot of my collage works and photographs that I work with, mainly photographs of, it's so heavy even just talking about it sometimes, colonial postcards that were taken of a lot of West African women and all over the continent, if we're going to be honest, but mainly I focus on West African people who were featured in these photographs. And these photographs were printed and trafficked all throughout Europe, all throughout the United States. And they were meant to spread these ideas of hypersexuality. They were meant to spread these ideas of the wealth and the power of the colony, importing and exporting. So I'm really interested in this kind of trafficking of images and what does it mean to like untraffic the traffic, right? What does it mean to pause them within their circulation and to really take a moment to really highlight the undercurrents of what's really going on or what happened within the photo. Okay, so that's kind of setting us up for all of these things that I'm going to go into. In 2019, I published my very first book of, you can't even call it poetry. It's like a hybrid. It's like prose, poetry, family photo album, newspaper clippings, musings, and a lot of elements like that. And it was a part of my senior thesis. I got a dual MFA at CalArts in critical studies, creative writing, and art. So you're looking at me holding the baby. That was my manuscript. On the cover, you will see various names, this kind of pseudo lineage. It's called the Lineage of a Negro. At the same time that I was working on this manuscript, which took me 10 years to publish, I was also collecting a lot of ways that we have historically and contemporarily like named the Black body. I'm interested in unofficial archives, archives that are like spoken, you know, on a daily basis. And what does it mean to collect and gather the language? So I went to Urban Dictionary. I mined a lot of rap lyrics, things that I heard in my childhood, so many kind of derogatory ways to name the body throughout history. And I collaged them all together and made this whole Linnaeus chart, this whole pedigree. And so now you have history that literally propagated and created these kind of figures. So you'll see Jet Black III, Jungle Bunny #1. Some of them are very graphic, so I'm not gonna say all of that, but you can read it for yourself. I would also put these names onto Avery name tags, where I would print 100 of them and do a whole grid on the wall. And so this whole idea of names that are attached to the Black body, well, okay, let's go ahead and make a name tag of this archive. And would you want to put this on your body, you know? And so, you know, I had my show at CalArts and people would come up to me and introduce themselves to me as some of these characters in this piece. And I would be like, oh my gosh. And so it was just really interesting that I was working on this book. My brother's first name is Sir, like yes, sir, no, sir. He was born in 1980. I always say my mama did it before Beyonce did. So, okay, 1980. She named him Sir because she wanted him to always have a title of respect, no matter who addressed him. And mind you, this is in Louisville, Kentucky. My mother went to school during the desegregation and the busings of the public schools. She was 16 years old when she had them. The Klan would wait to spit on them just to get on the school buses. She endured a lot of racial trauma. And so when she gave birth to the first male grandchild, her and my grandmother, it was a collaborative effort. They wanted to name him Sir. Now there is an unofficial, there's an unofficial story in the family that my granny actually wanted to name him Master, so that if we ever went back into enslavement, that the master would have to call him Master. And I was interviewing my granny and I was like, what? What were you thinking? Like, that is very intense for somebody to walk around with that name. I mean, Sir is an intense name that he had to walk around with. And then she goes, Master never came out of my mouth. I always knew I wanted to be Sir. So even as I'm trying to collect these archives of my family and these origin stories, there's always something that comes in that interrupts and disputes. And so there's so many different players of the history, you know? So I'm really fascinated with that. Growing up, I was always told that we had a lot of family photos, but a tree fell in the garage and we don't have nothing no more. Everything's gone. It's just, it's done. But then what I realized is that there are so many archivists in the family, and I call them the keepers. These are the people in the family that hold on to stuff and they don't even know why they're holding on to it. And then you have the seekers, the ones who are born into the family that are born to ask the questions that no one ever wants to talk about. What happened in the war? How did we cross the border? You know, who are these people that I just found in the attic and these pictures? And it's just like, we don't talk about it. It's too painful, or we literally don't know the information. So I feel that seekers are born to ask these questions of the family. And then what's beautiful is the keepers, they're like the Smithsonian. Like, you ain't getting these baby pictures. I don't care if you are in the baby picture. Like, I don't care if it's your baby picture. I'm keeping it. It's mine, right? And you have to have white gloves, everything. And you're just in somebody's living room, right? Going through the photo album. But I noticed something with doing this work, that once the seeker meets the keeper in the family, that trust is there. And oftentimes seekers are the artists or the archivists or the people who think out of the box. And then the keeper is like, I have like 90 of those photos in the attic. Do you need them right now? And you're like, oh my God. So that's what this whole project was. And I found out that aunties have the best photos. Okay. So my auntie really helped rescue this project that I had. And she found all of these photos of my mom, of my brother, because I didn't have a lot of the photos. I just started writing poems about encountering the photos. Like, I'm one of those people, like, you can't tell me what is lost, what I will never know. I will invent my own places, structures, tools to still tell the story. So with Sir, I was able to weave in a lot of family photos that we were told were just completely lost. And there's this famous story of the nurses, they were racist and they did not want to write my brother's name down on the birth certificate. So his names are strike through so many times because they didn't want to write them. And then they went to the Walgreens to go get a prescription filled for my brother. The pharmacist did not want to write Sir Hinkle, so the pharmacist wrote Baby Boy Hinkle instead. So you have these instances of also not wanting to write someone's name down, you know, and thinking about Jessica's, like, you know, the conversation about the archive, who appears in the archive, who doesn't get to appear, and all of those things. Even a personal effect such as a birth certificate. It's like, we're not going to give this young Black baby this name, right? Also within this book, Sir, I used unofficial kind of archives. This was my first hate mail that I've ever received. And it's because I was interviewed about this project called Kentifrica, which is a kind of merging of parts of Kentucky and West Africa. It's a contested geography. And it was really frustrating because the journalist who interviewed me, she pretty much took all of my research and kind of wrote it as her own and then quoted me as, there will be costumes and stuff. It's going to be fun. Like, so somebody read that I was going to be in this Made in LA biennial, the first one to ever exist. In 2012, I was the youngest artist to ever participate. And so they were upset that this journalist used African Americans instead of Black Americans. So I received this hate mail that was sent to the Hammer Museum telling me not to use that label when describing Black Americans. And, you know, they said our flag is red, white, and blue, but if you look at it, it kind of looks like a French flag. I mean, it's so much in this document. And mind you, I'm working with Lineage of a Negro. I'm working with all of these names that the Black body is like named. And then I thought it was so interesting that I'm receiving this letter that's telling me that Black people don't want to be called this. You know, like, this person is speaking for all Black people. And I'm like, I'm so confused. So I'm like, obviously this is going into the book. And here's the envelope. It was from the Black American Census. I was like, what the hell is that? Like, I don't even know what that means, but it was really cool. And then I'm not even gonna lie, so all of the blips and stuff on it was because I got water on it and it was really bad. And so I was like, I'm still gonna include this because I'm really interested in archival documents that have a life outside of just being behind the glass and not touched and not handled. So this is a collaboration between the journalists, the Black American Census, and me getting stuff on the letter. So this is printed in the book. Also, I went to the Louisville Public Library and I was just so shocked by their holdings. I mean, files and files and files of newspaper clipping. They're kind of not in acid-free stuff. I could have took some stuff, y'all, and been like, you know what? It wasn't much security. I know this is recorded, but it wasn't much security, but it was something so powerful about being able to access and touch these holdings, so much newspaper clippings. And so I was just photocopying like crazy. And I got to see this whole timeline of how the parks were desegregated. And, you know, my grandmother, she lived across the street from a former plantation that was then turned into a hotel, that was then turned into an amusement park, that was then vandalized due to segregation, and young Black people in the community. It was like, we can't come here, we're gonna shut it down. And then it was turned into another amusement park. And now it is the site of multi-million-dollar homes that are owned by Black people. All on the same site, near a park that was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, you know? And so much in Louisville has just de facto segregation, and Baltimore too, you know that. So I was really interested in like thumbing through all of these newspaper clippings and finding these kind of like source images, and also just printing them in the book and letting them speak for themselves. What I thought was so powerful about this card from the public library of their holdings, you can literally read line by line, and that tells you the entire story of the park. You know, youth attack workers at park, the police are called in, the city leases Ferry Park swim pool. Park is silent now, except for memories. Like, it's so poetic, you know, within itself. And what does it mean for my grandmother's house to be up the street from a place that she wasn't even allowed to even enter into, to even bring her children to go there, you know? I'm fascinated by this. And so I found so many of these clippings, and they became characters and hauntings within the book as well. I'm also doing a archive of somebody that does not want an archive to be written about them. You know, my brother was very against the book. He's like, why are you writing about me? I'm not, you know, I don't want that. But I was like, it's about your name. And it's like, this is larger than you. What does it mean to have a name that undefines the defined, you know? But so much of the book was about this intense weight of how he felt carrying that name that represented this traumatic legacy of enslavement. And then, you know, the stories continue. I mean, this is from the 1990s, cross burnings and just elements of like that, elements of that. Also, while I was working on the book, I could not find a picture of what Captain Aaron Fontaine's house looked like. That's who this whole plot of land and the park was named after. I mean, the amusement park was named after. It was believed that he would capture enslaved people who were trying to cross over the Ohio River. He would keep them there. And I was linked up with one of his descendants, and I was supposed to hire her to do all of this research for me. And she was like, we know nothing of enslaved individuals that were held in this place. We don't have any records. All our records that we have are property and land. And I was like, girl, but girl though, we were property. We were property. What do you mean that that's all that you have? Then you have something. And so she was kind of like refusing to kind of participate. And so I just, you know, I published the email anyways of her saying this, because that says so much, you know, it tells the story without telling it. So the book was stalling for years, and I was like, what's going on? And I kept feeling like the enslaved people at the property, they were like, you cannot publish this book until you talk about what happened to us at this in this land. So I went on to ancestry.com and I found the slave master census, you know, and lo and behold, this man's last will and testament was there, where he's leaving the enslaved people to his children. And so I put that in a book. This is the last page. This is the last page of the book, you know? And as a document within itself, I mean, it's so haunting and disturbing and beautiful at the same time, you know, like there it is right here. And I'm supposed to pay this descendant to tell me something that I already know, right? Gatekeeping, all of these things. So anywho, also I'm really fascinated, you know, Margaret Garner, the history of Margaret Garner, which inspired Toni Morrison to do Beloved. She was enslaved in Kentucky and was able to sled across the Ohio River when it froze over. And there's so many times that the Ohio River froze, over. Someone drove a Volkswagen across it. And I found this photo of people ice skating on this river that was this kind of liminal space between being free and not. So I kind of keep these archives around. I'm working on the second book. It's going to be a trilogy. And this time the book is going to be called Ma'am. And it's about naming and unnaming of women in my family. So, okay. How am I doing on time? Am I okay on time? Okay.
We're a little bit over.
Okay.
So if you want.
Actually, I don't mind kind of stopping there. I wanted to show a little bit of my artwork, but I mean, the book within itself is an archive and a piece of art too. But I could also thumb through things really, really fast, like in 2 minutes.
Yeah, if you want to give a quick overview so then we can jump to the conversation,
Okay.
that'd be awesome.
Okay, awesome. So these are some of the postcard images that I began working with, that I talked about with Tina Campt in this kind of my interest in trafficking, the trafficking of images. And I actually started a lot of this work when I was a student at MICA. I went on a class field trip. I was mistaken as someone that was being trafficked due to the intense trafficking trade that was going on there. But I was simultaneously collecting a lot of these postcard images because I was in a class with Dr. Leslie King Hammond, and I knew something was off within these images of these West African women and how their bodies were taken out of context. So a lot of the work that I do is through retrieval and interrupting the narratives of these complicated this residue of what it meant for these colonial forces to come in and to take a lot of these bodies out of context. So that kind of bridges us all the way back to kind of the beginning of what I was talking about. This is the recent work. It's called The Meeting. It was done, completed last year. And this image was one of the most difficult images that I had to work with. Me and my studio assistant, we like cut it out in complete silence. All of the women were not positioned in this way, and it was very anthropological. The photo was so tense and so just really disturbing with the silence and so much shame that I felt inside of the photo. So instead of leaving them in that state, I decided that they would be attending a meeting where they would be preparing to overthrow the powers that be. So a lot of times I'm working with these primary sources or these documents and talking and sometimes presenting them as is, and sometimes renegotiating what's going on within them. And I'm going to stop there. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I'm super excited to have the two of you in conversation. I do want to now just kind of open it up as well. I have some questions prepared, but I want to let folks know that you can please either raise your hand and we can, you can unmute and speak, or feel free to type into the chat if you have questions. This would be a great time to do that. And I'll just kind of dive in with a really basic one that I think is, I'm really interested to hear. Both of you talked about archives in all of these like really rich, wonderful ways. And it's clear, from the way both of you talked about it, that archives can mean kind of a lot of different things to different people. So I'd love to hear from both of you about what you think, really, like what to you is an archive.
I'll respond to that first. I think my response is pretty simple. For me, an archive is a way of connecting the past to the present to the future, and it's not necessarily an institution. It's not a repository. It's not a physical space necessarily. It's finding these sort of linear connections in a way that enables people living today to see themselves or aspects of themselves in the past, and kind of ensuring that people in the future are able to do the same, both for people living today and for people that are living or that lived before us. And I think in particular, archives, at least in my mind, are not confined to institutions, and they're not confined to buildings. They're not confined to universities or school, like libraries, archival institutions. It's just more it's a way of connecting culture and a way of connecting people to that culture.
I would agree with Jessica, especially about not defining an archive as something that belongs to an institution or entity or a specific place. I mean, instantly what comes to mind is that the archive is alive, is like a living being within itself, you know? And oftentimes when we think of archives, we think of like dead and past and old and forgotten, or, you know, all of these kind of magical things too that the archive is supposed to be, or, you know, forbidden, taboo, or, you know, the things they don't want us to see, or things that we only need to look at, you know? And I just feel like the archive is a living entity, you know? And I feel that this is kind of strange, but the archive is also like a ghost, like it haunts and it shows itself to people that it wants to show itself to, and some people it doesn't, you know? Yeah, I mean, my idea about the archive is very abstract, you know, because there are so many archives. I believe our body is an archive. We store memories, we store experiences, transgenerational trauma, so many different elements. For instance, my mother knows how to do a lot of Nigerian hairstyles, but she's never been to Nigeria. I always say her fingers have, but she hasn't been, you know? That's an archive. Like, how do you know what you don't know, but you know what you know? Like, I don't know. Archives are very ephemeral to me. I feel like the objects within the archives are the catalyst or the kind of residue from, like, you know, living. So that's my ghost lady take on it.
I love that. And I love the ghost lady like moniker. You did a really great job of kind of talking and thinking through naming in archives and like what naming means, which I thought was really great. There's a question for you actually in the chat, Kenyatta, which is just if you could expand more on Alan Lomax. Regina missed what you said and was curious about his relationship to your work.
So I'm obsessed with work songs that happen in prisons that, there were so many prisons that were built on top of plantations, you know, literally enslavement upon enslavement. And one famous one was Parchment Farms. And Alan Lomax, he was, how would you call him? I have other names for him, but he was a collector of kind of folk music, audio, ephemeral experiences in the African diaspora. Like, so he would go to these prisons and he would record inmates' work songs. And they were being forced to work to death, you know, on behalf of the state. Some of them were convicted, you know, murderers, and some were framed for things that they didn't do, you know. And within the African diaspora, within a lot of world traditions, people sing songs while they work. And so Alan Lomax, he became famous off of collecting a lot of these recordings and got money from them. But he was collecting the songs of enslaved individuals through the prison industrial complex who never saw a penny, you know, from these recordings, which is early blues music, early American history. It's happening right now. You know, a lot of Black recording artists are really upset. I went to a Robert Glasper concert and he said that you have to stream one of his songs 1,500 times before he can see for it to register as one album sale. Okay. So what I do, I found this one song called Black Woman. And it says, I don't want no jet black woman. She too mean. She's too mean, you know? And I was like, hold on. And then they said, I don't want no bald headed woman because she too mean. I was like, well, I'm bald headed and jet black. So what does that mean? What does that mean? And you can hear their hammers like hitting. So when I was working with this project called the Evanescence, I began working with this work song and kind of channeling all of these disappeared Black women, historically and presently, all through this soundtrack of these workers who are talking about Black women, you know. When you see my long-haired woman, bow your head, and you know, it was the lyrics were so powerful. So that's why I bring up kind of Alan Lomax, and Alan Lomax is no different from the colonials who showed up in Nigeria with their cameras and like, we're going to take pictures of these women in the market. We're going to put them on postcards and traffic them all over the world. Sorry if there's any Alan Lomax fans, but problematic. So yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, there's another question in the chat that Lulu asks that also relates to a question I had for Jess. So this question's for you, Kenyatta, but I think there's kind of a counterpart for Jess as well. So Lulu asks, my question is, you spoke of stumbling across touching and feeling objects / materials that you use in your artwork. Do you traditionally research inside of quote unquote traditional archives like a museum, archive, university archive? And do you have good or bad experiences researching, especially as those archives are typically considered quote unquote closed stacks? And then I'll let you answer it. And then I have a kind of related question for our practicing archivist in the room.
I just worked on a public art commission for Bayview Hunters Point, in which there's been a lot of environmental injustice to this community. 80% of San Francisco's waste is produced in this community, where 6% of San Francisco's population is Black, and that 6% lives in a place where 80% of that waste is digested, right? People in the community started getting cancers, dying, very young, human rights issues going on there. And I was hired by the public utilities, San Francisco Public Utilities, the water company there pretty much, to do a public art, you know, commission. And so I work with photos of unknown people, you know, from the community. And so I was working with the Shades of Bayview archive that the San Francisco Public Library had. They got a grant because there's rapid gentrification of Black people in San Francisco. You know, people are being forced out. And so they collected all of these photos from people in the community, but the photos are just in a book behind the library desk in the Bayview branch only. And you have to ask the librarian for the book. You have to like know what to say and where to find them. And for me, that was a kind of violent gatekeeping. And it took me a whole year to just get access to all of the photos, even though I was working for the city to do this public art project for this community. So it was very problematic gatekeeping. And it made me so infuriated that instead of using a few photos, I was like, todos. I'm using every photo in this archive. This will be a crowd of people on the walls that will be on these walls permanently, you know? So I guess that kind of speaks to, you know, your question, but yeah, it's highly problematic, and it's something that I face kind of daily in doing this work. And I call this piece that I created for this city visual restorative justice because of that gatekeeping with the archive.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really powerful story. And I guess just for you, my question is kind of what is the importance and what are the ways that archivists and others in the field can do to kind of change the way that Black people and other marginalized groups are able to interact with archives? Like, what do you see happening now, and what do you envision as maybe a better future for that?
I think that's a really good question. I think we're seeing, and I think a lot of this is basically due to societal and cultural shifts towards social justice and towards just taking active measures towards equity, inclusivity. We're seeing a much more intentional effort by both like archivists and community members to better preserve Black history and to embrace the fact that Black history is American history, but it's not just American history. It's American history, it's global history, it's such an integral part of American culture that people are seeing the value in that. People outside of Black culture are acknowledging the value. And I think that in part that's due to there's increased diversity in the archival field, but that doesn't fully explain the shift towards, an increase in intentional efforts to preserving Black history. I think there's much more turnover. As older people sort of age out of archives, we're much more likely to see more progressive ideas becoming much more mainstream, and that's going to lead to shifts in the archival field. Nowadays, it's much more standard, it's much more normal to hear we need to involve people that are actually part of this community rather than just trying to, nobody wants to use the word exploit, but that's what was happening for centuries. I mean, it was just straight exploitation and appropriation, and we need like more people that are actually acknowledging the fact that that's what was happening. That's what was stolen from Black people and other marginalized groups for so long. And now that we're at a point where Black people are more vocal about that and other people are becoming more vocal about that, we're seeing more archivists of color, more archivists from the LGBTQ community, more archivists who really are like dedicated to documenting the experiences, the perspectives, the various forms of expression, whether that's spoken word, hip hop, music, poetry. I mean, people are also able to do that themselves now, which I think is a huge asset to preserving Black culture. And I think it's taken like decades or even centuries of rejection from those sorts of institutions for us to, I think we always knew if we had the ability, we would preserve our own culture, but that wasn't necessarily the case for a long time. Now that we have the ability to do that, we're much better equipped to preserve our own history. And I think that's why you see so many independent archives, so many community archives, because a lot of these groups have just been so pushed out, so excluded from archives that you just kind of get fed up and decide we can do this ourselves. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot more of these days. And I think that it's a very like beneficial asset to have technology. I hope that at some point there will be some sort of resolution, but I'm not sure if that's going to happen right now. And I'm very happy with the way that we're able to do it ourselves to some extent, because at the very least, we're preserving our history and culture today. And then later on, maybe there can be this shift towards actually like connecting or meshing the two. I think at this point, though, we're kind of headed in these two sorts of like parallel or almost like exclusive realms of archival practice, where there's very well established institutions and community archives that are becoming better equipped to just do it themselves.
Yeah, I love that. I think you really got at the kind of interesting tension we find ourselves in the moment between like community archives and institutional archives. And I think you spoke with such a hope that I think I often don't always have. So I really appreciate that answer. But I see we have a hand up. So I wanted to invite Erica, if you wanted to share your question, you can go ahead and unmute.
Oh, thank you. So my question is, I recently graduated from the University of Maryland College Park from their MLIS program, and I'm currently in the job market. But I want to lean more into community archives because, as you just spoke about, I have found that the discrimination and the being pushed out, because I'm like, I really like this work. Why won't anybody hire me? And so I'm just wondering, like, I've been applying to a few here and there, but I'd like to know more about different community archives because I'd love to help out a lot of people doing community archives. And, I'd like to know more about who might need my assistance because I don't mind lending a hand.
I would say I posted a link to honestly, I can't name specific places that are like looking for people at this point, but I posted a link earlier and I can post it again in the comments that it's just a Twitter link, but it offers a ton of different resources as far as community archives go that people are kind of highlighting. I think I'm not really sure right now what places are hiring, and there are going to be a lot of places where they don't necessarily have the finances to hire, which is an unfortunate thing. Nobody should have to work for free, but also it's kind of an unfortunate consequence to having limited funding for a lot of these projects. I would say if you have interest in something, reaching out to those organizations directly, highlighting what your interests are. If you're interested in preserving Black history and culture in a specific region, even just Googling like Community Archive Baltimore, you'll come up with a couple of different resources. The Preserve the Baltimore Uprising, we're not incredibly active, but there are also, I'm trying to think, there's a couple of different, community. I would also consider reaching out to different community centers and neighborhood resources that might have a need for preservation. There are a lot of places where, even just like the Poppleton community in Baltimore, where they are actively trying to, retain their neighborhood to some extent. They're at risk for demolition in a lot of these blocks, and the need to preserve their history and their experiences. I know that there are a couple of professors at UMBC right now that are currently working with them, including Professor Nicole King, who is the head of the American Studies department there. Just groups like that may be in need of support in terms of maintaining their histories and their records. I can't really offer much more, but I'll include the link to all of these different resources that I think that solution is the suggestion that Shawn just offered. If you don't work in an official or community archive, you can always build this kind of work into library and information sciences work. So if you get a job in other places, just, kind of pushing the institution in the direction or drawing attention to something like that, it obviously depends on your level of comfortability in a new job situation, but it's very easy to encourage supervisors or colleagues, especially trusted supervisors and colleagues, mentors, to kind of expressing that that is your main interest or one of your interests seems like a great option. I'm sorry, I can't offer much more.
I just put another link into We Hear, which is another project by a former librarian here, Jenny Ferretti, who's now at Digital Library Foundation. But We Hear is a great space for folks who are POC working in libraries. And, you know, there's all kinds of things like community school where you can take classes. There's a publication. It's also like just a community where people talk about jobs and things like that. So that can be a really, really great tool. So we have like 5 more minutes. So I wanted to check in to see if there's any questions. I see a lot of people are putting helpful like messages in the chat about job searching, which is a very librarian thing to do. But I'm also, you know, one of the things that for me kind of came up in both of your presentations, and I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about is, what are maybe some of the ways, and maybe we can end with this, you know, what are some of the ways that you both see Black artists specifically complicating this notion of like what can and should be an archive?
That's a really hard question to end on. That's like
Sorry to stump you. I didn't mean to.
No, I think that's a great question. I'm just kind of in awe of Black artists, to be perfectly honest, because I think artists in general are just such, you know, they think in ways that non or less artistic people, it's a completely different way of thinking. It's a completely different way of interacting with the world around you, with people around you. And I think Black artists, you know, just make American culture. I think they make Black culture. It's not just about physical works of art. It's about the ways that we pass on aspects of culture. And it's kind of like when Kenyatta was talking about how her mom knows how to braid like traditional Nigerian hairstyles and how to create those hairstyles, even if she's never actually been to Nigeria. That's something that, you know, you pass on. And it's the ways that we, even just learning about why Black people were braiding their hair in the United States, for instance, sometimes it was to hide things that they wanted to preserve. And they carried on that sort of culture keeping from, you know, one continent to another and passed it on from generation to generation. When I learned to braid my hair when I was a kid, I never learned that part of it until later, but you still learn the process. And I think there are just so many forms of art that can't be contained in traditional archives and institutions that are so essential to understanding Black history and culture. And that's one of the ways that I think they're just pushing those boundaries. You know, I'm not sure if there's going to be an easy resolution, but I think right now, like, Black art is making people question what can and should be contained in an archive, and whether or not, you know, a land deed is more significant than a piece of poetry or folklore or you know, a work song. I think all of those things are just as essential to American culture. So
yes, to everything that Jessica said. Also, I didn't have enough time, but I'm in this exhibition called The Black Index that is curated by Bridget Cooks, and it features the works of Lava Thomas, Dennis Delgado, Titus Kaphar, Whitfield Lovell, myself, and it's one other artist that I'm blanking on, but it was a really powerful traveling exhibition, and now it's on its last leg at Hunter College, but it was so powerful because it talks about Black death and Black elevation in response to so much police state sanctioned violence. But it also talks about kind of pushing back against the archive, you know, and kind of doing portraiture that like negates all kind of definition. Like Lava Thomas is working with mugshots from the civil rights movement and rendering them in high detail. So you can see when someone is holding up the placard and they just have on a glove and they don't have on their other glove. So that tells you a story, like something happened there. Whitfield Lovell is working with playing cards and working on 52 portraits, where he takes a vintage playing card and he partners it up with this beautifully rendered portrait, like of a person, and kind of putting these two together to tell this story. Dennis Delgado is working with artificial intelligence and all of the ways that data is taken of like Black people and blurring them into where you can't recognize like this person's face, and talking about the inherent racism that is within artificial intelligence, technologies, and data collection. I mean, I know this is a plug for this group show that I'm in, but when we talk about like Black artists and the archive and like these conversations that are happening now, this sort of scholarship and the exhibitions that are now starting to be built, I mean, it's phenomenal. I put the website link in the thing. There's even a sonic soundscape that was created for the exhibition. They even created a font that is about redacting things from the archive. And there also should be sound meditations on there, and links to talks and public programming that they've done around Blackness in the archive and Black death. And I mean, it was just such a phenomenal experience to be a part of. And this went on during the pandemic, with these shows kind of being put up and traveling to all of these various sites. So I highly recommend everybody here just like really checking it out and sitting with that. And that's how I want to answer that.
That was like a really perfect answer to that. You were like, I can't answer that question. And then let me just do a really perfect job of doing it.
The most, yeah, like the most wonderful answer that you could, oh, here's something that I've done. And yeah, you handled that. All right.
So great. I appreciate both of you so much. I want to respect everyone's time, and we're at the end of our time here, but this was such a wonderful and enriching conversation. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you as well to everyone who attended and asked questions. We really appreciate this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having us. This was phenomenal. Oh my gosh.
And thanks to Naz.
Yes, to Naz. Behind the scenes. Yes.
All right.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.